For most of human history, living in a city was one of the most dangerous things you could do. Not dangerous because of crime, not dangerous because of war, dangerous because of something far quieter, far slower, and far more lethal than any invading army. The cities themselves were killing people every single day, and for centuries, nobody fully understood why. Humans built cities to survive better together, to trade, to cooperate, to protect each other. And yet, for most of recorded history, more people died inside cities than were ever born in them. Cities only kept growing because a constant stream of people from the countryside kept arriving to replace the dead. Without that migration, most ancient and medieval cities would have simply emptied out within a few generations. But here is the part that almost nobody talks about. The thing killing millions of city dwellers was not a plague that arrived from outside. It was something humans built themselves, something completely ordinary, something cities were absolutely full of. And the person who eventually identified the killer was not a king, not a general, not even a celebrated scientist. He was a quiet physician who spent his evenings walking the streets of London, recording the addresses of the dead. And the tool he used to crack the case was a map. We will get to that map, but first you need to understand just how bad things got. Imagine London in the year 1800. Population, roughly 1 million people. Streets packed with horses, merchants, workers, children, markets overflowing, taverns full, the city buzzing with noise from before sunrise until well past dark. And underneath all of it, running beneath the cobblestones, hidden completely from sight, rivers of human waste. London had no modern integrated sewer system. Neither did Paris, neither did New York. People threw waste out of windows directly into the streets. They dumped it into rivers. They buried it in cesspits dug beneath their own homes. In the most crowded slums, dozens of families shared a single privy, built directly over a cesspit that nobody had emptied in years. And those cesspits leaked, slowly, constantly, invisibly, into the groundwater. The water people drank every morning came from wells dug into that same ground. For centuries, nobody made the connection. The water looked clean, it tasted fine, you could not see anything wrong with it. And yet, in city after city, decade after decade, people kept dying from the same terrifying illness. Violent cramps, unstoppable vomiting, dehydration so severe that victims' skin turned ashen and their eyes sank into their skulls. People who seemed perfectly healthy in the morning were dead by nightfall. Cholera. It spread out of India in 1817, swept across Asia, through Russia, into Europe, and across the Atlantic within years. Cities were its perfect hunting ground. Dense populations, contaminated water, no real understanding of how disease moved from person to person. But here is where the story gets genuinely strange, because for decades after cholera arrived in Europe, the most respected medical minds on the continent were not just wrong, they were confidently, institutionally wrong. The dominant theory was miasma, bad air. Disease rose from foul-smelling vapors, rotting matter, general filth. Breathe in enough of it and you got sick. It seemed logical. Cities smelled terrible, cities were full of disease. And in a strange irony, miasma theory actually led to some genuine improvements. Cities cleaned streets, improved ventilation, removed visible waste. All of that helped, but for the wrong reasons. The real killer kept flowing invisibly through the water supply, completely untouched. Physicians who raised doubts were dismissed. One German doctor named Max von Pettenkofer spent years arguing that contaminated soil was involved, without quite landing on water as the direct mechanism. He was largely ignored. Even officials who watched outbreak after outbreak strike the same neighborhoods, the same blocks, the same streets, kept returning to the same comfortable answer: bad air. The miasma theory felt true, and it had the weight of centuries behind it. This is where John Snow enters the story. Snow was a physician in London, methodical, skeptical. He had treated enough cholera patients to sense the miasma explanation simply did not hold up. Workers in the foulest-smelling parts of the city did not always get sick. People in apparently clean neighborhoods died in sudden clusters. Something else was moving through those communities. Then, in late August 1854, cholera erupted in Soho. Within 10 days, more than 500 people living within a few blocks of Broad Street had died.
Snow went there not primarily to treat patients, but to investigate. He went door to door, recorded every death, every address, every detail he could find. Then he marked each one on a street map of the neighborhood. And slowly, out of dozens of individual tragedies, a shape emerged. The deaths were not scattered randomly. They were clustering, tight, unmistakable. At the center, a water pump on Broad Street. Snow brought his findings to the local boards of guardians. The pump was the source, he argued. Contaminated water was driving the outbreak. Not bad air, water. The handle was removed. In the days that followed, the outbreak faded. Snow was careful in his own writings never to claim the pump removal alone ended it. The epidemic may already have been subsiding as vulnerable residents fled the area. What his investigation proved was where the cases were coming from. He had traced a killer back to its source using observation, interviews, and a piece of paper. One of the first rigorous epidemiological investigations in history. And for years afterward, most of the medical establishment still did not believe him. John Snow died in 1858. The scientific consensus only shifted substantially after his death, as germ theory developed and laboratory science finally caught up with what his map had already shown. The man who cracked one of the most consequential public health problems in history did not live to see himself proven right. But the problem did not wait. Cholera kept coming, the second pandemic, the third, the fourth, and slowly the evidence became impossible to keep dismissing. And here's the detail that almost never makes it into the textbook version of this story. Before London's sewer project even began, the smell rising off the Thames in summer had grown so overpowering that Parliament was forced to hang curtains soaked in lime chloride on the windows of the Houses of Parliament just to make the building bearable. Members debated evacuating the capital. It was called the Great Stink of 1858. And it accomplished in one hot summer what decades of cholera deaths had not. It made the problem a political emergency. Money was approved, construction began. The engineer behind it was Joseph Bazalgette. More than 80 miles of large brick-lined underground tunnels connected to over 1,000 miles of smaller street sewers carrying waste downstream to the Thames estuary, far from where people lived and drank. Bazalgette reportedly chose to make every pipe significantly larger than his calculations required. His reasoning, as recorded by those who worked with him, "We are only going to do this once. Let us build it for the future." As the sewers came online through the 1860s, death rates in London dropped, not gradually, sharply. The same shift appeared in Hamburg, Chicago, Paris, and New York. For the first time in centuries, cities began producing more births than deaths. The engineers who built those systems almost certainly saved more lives than any physician of their era. Almost none of them are remembered. But cities kept doing it. They cleaned the water, then they poisoned the air. For most of the industrial era, London was regularly choked by coal smoke so thick it fused with cold fog into what locals called pea soupers. Yellow-brown clouds, streets darkened at noon, visibility reduced to the length of an outstretched arm. People described it not as a crisis, but as weather, just winter in London, just the price of progress. Then, in December 1952, a mass of cold air settled over the city and refused to move. For 5 days, coal smoke from millions of fireplaces and factories had nowhere to go. It accumulated. Buses stopped running because drivers could not see the road ahead. Inside theaters, performances were canceled because audiences could not see the stage through the haze creeping under the doors. At a livestock show at Earl's Court, prize cattle died from the air. And then people began dying too. Not dozens, thousands. Estimates of excess deaths from those 5 days range between 4,000 and 12,000, with tens of thousands more suffering lasting respiratory damage in the weeks that followed. The Great Smog lasted 5 days. The Clean Air Act followed in 1956. And then there was lead. For much of the 20th century, your city was saturated with it. It was in the paint on your walls. It was in the pipes carrying your water, and beginning in the 1920s, it was in the gasoline burning in every car and truck on every street. Tetraethyl lead was added to fuel to prevent engine knocking. Researchers raised safety concerns at the time of its introduction. Workers at early production facilities suffered severe neurological symptoms. Some died. The product went to market anyway. For roughly 50 years, every major city on Earth exhaled lead into the air. It settled into soil and dust, onto sidewalks and windowsills, into the spaces where children played. And lead was poison for the developing brain. It reduced cognitive function, it damaged impulse control, and the harm accumulated quietly, year after year, in ways that were invisible until they were not. Researchers eventually documented a striking correlation. City by city, crime rates appeared to rise and fall in rough alignment with childhood lead exposure levels, offset by roughly 2 decades, about the time it took exposed children to reach early adulthood. The lead crime hypothesis remains debated and difficult to prove as direct causation, but it has been documented across enough cities and countries that a substantial number of public health researchers consider it credible. The United States completed its phase-out of leaded gasoline for road vehicles in 1996. The last nations to finish did so in the early 2020s. A full global transition that took nearly a century from the time the dangers were first clearly identified. Think about that. A century. But cities kept doing it. And so the question that historians and public health researchers are now beginning to ask out loud is this: what are today's cities quietly building into their own foundations right now? What is the thing that people 100 years from now will look back at with the same disbelief you feel reading about cesspits draining into drinking wells? Researchers point to noise pollution, now linked to measurable cardiovascular damage in dense urban environments, to microplastics accumulating in water and food at concentrations current science cannot yet fully evaluate, to food environments engineered so that the cheapest and most convenient option is almost always the least healthy one. None of these have produced their great smog moment yet. None have found their Jon Snow, someone willing to walk the streets, record what they see, and draw the map that makes the invisible finally legible. But somewhere in the city you live in right now, a pipe is leaking into groundwater. An air quality reading is sitting in a database that nobody in power has opened yet. A planning decision is being made that will shape how millions of people live for the next 50 years by people who cannot fully see what it will produce at scale. The question is not whether the next map will be drawn, it is whether we will listen early enough.